There have been a lot of factions in wrestling history, and as a result of that, there have been a lot of faction members. So many faction members have there been, in fact, some have gotten lost amongst the cracks over the years, even if they've been members of notable groups. Yes, for every figure like Ric Flair who came to define the Four Horsemen, or Hollywood Hogan who came to personify the NWO, there have been the people we're going to be looking at today, the forgotten members of stables, with one of the greatest examples of this being our first subject, Manu, and the time he briefly became a member of the Legacy. That's right, while it's easy to remember the Legacy today as being the trio made up of second and third generation stars Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes, and Ted DiBiase Jr., there were other members of the faction early on in their history, and one of these was Manu. Who was Manu? Well, he was a member of the Anoa'i family, more specifically the son of Afa and cousin to future WWE champion Roman Reigns. So with this pedigree then, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Manu must have made a big impact when he first appeared on WWE TV back in late 2007 as the newest member of the then fledgling group. But for whatever reason, he just never gelled with his other three more famous stablemates, and for that reason, his time with them would be short-lived. In fact, it would be so short-lived that in total, it only lasted for 3 months officially. No time at all by wrestling standards. So that's why today, when you think about the Legacy, you almost certainly think of the Viper, the American Nightmare, and to a lesser extent, the son of the $1 Million Man. But you don't think of the Anoa'i family member. Would things have been different for Manu if he'd come around in modern-day WWE? Absolutely, as there he would have no doubt played a part in the Bloodline angle, but in the late 2000s, the Bloodline wasn't around, and so he had to settle for a brief team-up with other second and third generation superstars instead, a team-up which has since gone forgotten by most, at least in terms of his role in the proceedings. But Manu isn't the only Ruthless Aggression era star who found himself becoming the forgotten member of a popular stable. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, and his time in La Familia. Who are we talking about here? Why, Bam Neely, of course. Yes, Bam Neely might not be the most memorable of characters from the Ruthless Aggression era. After all, his list of accolades in WWE pretty much amount to him being a big guy and not much else. Not that this stopped him from trying to get over in 2008 though, as that was the year the Robbinsdale native would join Edge's heel stable. How would he fare as part of La Familia? Well, as you can probably guess by his inclusion in today's video, not very well. No, rather than be pushed as a major player within the group, Bam Neely was effectively relegated to WWE CW during this period, where he served the lone role of being Chavo Guerrero's heavy back when Guerrero was that brand's world champion. Sure, he would appear on SmackDown from time to time too, but never in a way that made him feel like an essential member of the group. In fact, for the most part, it would have been easy to forget he and Edge were associated at all, as they had so little to do with one another. So perhaps that was why, by the time August of 2008 came around, Neely would be unceremoniously dumped from La Familia and sent back to the undercard from whence he came. Was it sad that things worked out this way? Sure it was, as it would have been nice for Bam to at least get a chance of doing more with the group, but things worked out the way they did, and so as it stands today, he's the forgotten member of La Familia. Just like our next subject served the unfortunate role of being the forgotten member of his own stable, Imperium. That's right, it's time to talk about Alexander Wolf. That's right, while Imperium has only ever had 3 members on the main roster, Gunther, Ludwig Kaiser, and Giovanni Vinci, back when the stable were working on NXT and NXT UK, there was a 4th member within their ranks, and that member was Alexander Wolf. Yes, back when the others were going by their real names of Walter, Marcel Bartel, and Fabian Eichner, they were a quartet. And it was while working as a quartet that they had some of their biggest successes such as winning the NXT United Kingdom title and the NXT Tag Team titles on 2 separate occasions. So what happened to cause 4 to become 3 then? Well, the dreaded budgetary issues, as in 2021 the Dresden-born star would be cut from his contract as part of yet another wave of releases. And this meant he'd never get a chance to make it to SmackDown with the other members of the group when they finally got their call-ups not long thereafter. And because NXT has always had a smaller audience than the blue brand or the red brand, this means that today, many have no idea Wolf was ever a member of Imperium at all. No, for them, his contributions towards the group have gone completely forgotten. And this is sad, as Alexander Wolf has always been a very good wrestler, and with European nationality and stiff in-ring style, he was a perfect fit for Imperium, a much better fit than he had been for his previous stable, Sanity. In fact, you could argue he's just as good as either Ludwig Kaiser or Fabian Eichner. But then we guess this is just how things work out sometimes. It's certainly the way things worked out for our next subject, a forgotten member of the stable we mentioned a moment ago, none other than Sawyer Fulton and his run with Sanity. That's right, this is another example of the makeup of a stable being very different on the main roster compared to the way it was down in developmental. As well on Raw and SmackDown, Sanity might have been made up of Eric Young, Killian Dane, and the aforementioned Alexander Wolf. Down in NXT, there were two other members, Nikki Cross and Sawyer Fulton. Of course, even if you were a fan of Sanity from their black and gold days though, you'd be forgiven for forgetting the latter was ever there, as his run with the heel gang lasted for a short period of time. What happened to cause this relationship to be cut so short? Well, injury played a role, as not long after the original foursome of Young, Cross, Wolf, and Fulton all came together in 2016, the Toledo native would suffer a torn pectoral muscle, which took him out of action for several months. But rather than invite him back into the fold once he was healthy again, the rest of Sanity took this as an opportunity to eject him from the group off screen, meaning he'd never be seen wearing their colors after this. No, instead, his role would largely be filled by Killian Dane. And with this leaving Sawyer Fulton with little else to do in NXT then, it must have seemed inevitable that he was going to be cut from his contract, something which happened in November of 2017. What would he do from there? Well, he would make a decent name for himself working in Impact as Madman Fulton. But as for any future association with Sanity, well, that would be nowhere to be found. And this has meant that because he was only in the stable so briefly, it's very easy to forget he was ever there at all today. But then, it's not like NXT are any strangers to this, because outside of the examples we've already mentioned with Imperium and Sanity, there are plenty of other times a stable on the developmental brand has had a forgotten member. And if you want another perfect example of this, you only have to look to our next subject, Bodhi Hayward, and his time as part of Chase U. Yes, given how integral a part of NXT Chase U are today, it'd be easy for most fans to rattle off their list of members with ease. Duke Hudson, Riley Osborne, Thea Hale, and of course the leader, Andre Chase. Hell, it would also be easy to list most of the past members of the group too. People like Ridge Holland, JC Jane, and even Jasmine Nix. One person it might be difficult to remember as part of 2.0's resident group of college students, however, would be Bodhi Hayward, and that's because even if he was there for almost a year, and even if he was a founding member of the stable, he rarely did anything notable. No, during the early days of Chase U, it would be Andre Chase getting all the glory, with him being the clear top dog amongst the then trio made up of him, Hale, and Hayward. It was obvious where most of the spotlight was going to shine. And while the aforementioned Thea Hale was still largely in the background here too, she had a lot more to do than her fellow student-in-arms, Bodhi. So it perhaps should come as little surprise then that in November of that same year, a mere 10 months after Chase U formed, things would be shaken up when Hayward was sent packing and Duke Hudson was brought in as his replacement instead. And we all know what happened from there. The teacher-student collective went from strength to strength as they added further recruits to their numbers, then rose up to the point of becoming a key part of NXT, so much so that on 2 separate occasions, they'd win the NXT Tag Team titles. Of course, with this meteoric rise happening so fast though, it's left Bodhi Hayward's early contributions to the group largely forgotten, as no one really thinks of that era of Chase U anymore. And it's not as if he'd get a chance to recover from this after the fact, because almost immediately upon being dropped by his teammates, Hayward would be cut from his WWE contract too, with him spending the years since working on the indie circuit, patiently waiting for the time a chance to return to the big leagues arises. But let's move away from WWE for the time being and over to TNA, as that's where we find our next subject, someone better known for his time in the Octagon than the Squared Circle. That said, this shouldn't suggest that there wasn't a time Tito Ortiz was doing something notable in the wrestling business, as back in 2013, he briefly became a member of Aces and Eights. Yes, after announcing his retirement from cage fighting in 2012, the former UFC light heavyweight champion was on the lookout for a new world to conquer. And luckily for him, he'd already had an in with TNA at this point, as years prior in 2005, he'd infamously make a few appearances there as a special guest referee. So that made it all the easier for him to show up there all over again in August of 2013, though this time, rather than play the role of babyface enforcer, he'd instead quickly turn heel and join forces with Aces and Eights. Of course, if you were to ask people to list their top 5 favorite members of Impact's resident biker gang today, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find anyone who would name the Huntington Beach bad boy amongst their ranks. And the reason for that is because he was barely there at all in the grand scheme of things. No, while in totality Aces and Eights would be around for a full 17 months during its initial run, Ortiz would only be there for one of those months, and during that 1 month, the one thing he'd do of note would be to help Bully Ray to win the TNA World title from Chris Sabin. Why was this run so short-lived? Well, because Bellator, the company Tito had by then signed with, decided to pull him from any future dates with Impact, as they wanted him fit and ready to come out of retirement for a fight with Rampage Jackson, a fight which never ended up happening. And because his loyalties lay with the MMA promotion, it meant the future mayor of Huntington Beach would have to say goodbye to the Squared Circle all over again, and goodbye to his time with the heel faction too. Needless to say then, on account of its brevity, barely anyone remembers this association ever happened today. Still, it could be worse. After all, Tito Ortiz went on to do more great things inside the octagon after leaving Impact behind, and that's not something which could be said for our next subject, Paul Roma, following his time with the Four Horsemen. Not that Paul Roma was ever an MMA fighter, of course. No, he was always a wrestler first and foremost. But while you'd think an affiliation with the likes of Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and Ole Anderson would have done wonders for his career, in the end it pretty much killed any hopes the New York native ever had of being taken seriously again. Why was this? Well, because his time with the Horsemen was so forgettable, there's a solid argument to be made for him being the worst member the faction ever had, even worse than Steve McMichael. After all, while McMichael was never what you'd call a workhorse exactly, he had a huge amount of star power on account of his time playing as a defensive tackle in the NFL, something which could never be replicated by Roma, even on his best day. No, the sad reality when it came to him was that, while he was a very capable wrestler, he was much more of a journeyman performer, the kind of person who, during the territory days, would have been brought in for a few months to work with a bigger star and give them some shine. So why anyone thought it was a good idea to add the 4-time tag team champion to the flashiest stable in all of wrestling is anyone's guess. And so maybe that's why Roma hasn't been anywhere near as celebrated as any of the other members, with this making him even more forgotten as a consequence. But at least things turned out better for him after he left the stable, right? Well, no, because after being dumped by the Nature Boy and company, it would be a quick fall into irrelevance, as by 1998, his career was over for good. Luckily then, not every performer has their career wrecked by a forgotten inclusion in a stable. No, some thrive after the fact. And if you need any evidence of this, just look at our next subject and what he did after his time in the NWO. Who are we talking about here? Who else but Booker T. Yes, well, Booker was never in the NWO during their WCW days. He would become a member of the group once it migrated over to WWE in 2002. Of course, few remember this now though, because by the time the 5-time WCW champion came on board, things had already fallen to such a level that barely anyone was interested in watching the once mighty group anymore. Yes, after the heights they'd reached down in Atlanta, it was always going to be a hard task for Vince McMahon to replicate that same level of success in his own company. But he did give it a try when Hollywood Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall all debuted at No Way Out in February of that year. That said, once the Hulkster turned face and left the group at WrestleMania just 1 month later, the WWE version of the NWO suddenly found themselves struggling to stay relevant. And this was exactly why a number of people would be brought in to try and bolster the ranks at that point, with most of these names having some prior connection to the group, whether that be because they were previous members like The Big Show and X-Pac, or because they were in the Clique, like was the case with Shawn Michaels. One person who seemingly had no prior connection to the NWO, however, was Booker T. Yes, outside of him being in WCW, there was absolutely no association here, and there was nothing in Booker's character which made it seem like he'd fit in with the heel faction. Of course, there's always the possibility that might have changed as time went on and he grew more and more comfortable donning the black and white, but there was never any opportunity for this in the end, as just 1 month after throwing up the Too Sweet for the first time, the Houston native would quite literally be kicked out of the group by HBK. And we all know what happened after that. A month or so later, the entire NWO would be disbanded, leaving these last couple of months, and as well as Booker T's inclusion during them, to be relegated to the forgotten parts of history. Yes, while the current NXT commentator might be remembered for a lot of things, winning the WCW World title 5 times, that supermarket brawl with Steve Austin, one thing few, if any, will be thinking about when it comes time for his career retrospectives to be made will be his run as a member of the New World Order. But then Booker T isn't the only forgotten member of the NWO who also happens to be a WWE Hall of Famer. No, there's at least one more person this statement applies to, the man who once went by the moniker of the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, Bret Hart. Now, you'd be forgiven for forgetting all about this one, as it happened during the period where WCW was in complete freefall and about to go out of business. That's right, the magical period that was the WCW in 2000. Well, we say it all happened during 2000, but there was actually a brief period prior to this in 1998 where the Hitman actually served as an associate member of the group too, because it appears that WCW truly had no idea what to do with Bret Hart at the turn of the millennium. However, his initial 1998 run with them was so short-lived it has since been lost to time. But as we mentioned a moment ago, this wasn't the only time the Hitman joined the NWO. No, towards the end of 1999, the group would be reborn again with him, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Jeff Jarrett, and Scott Steiner involved, with this group being labeled NWO 2000. Needless to say then, like with Blues Brothers 2000 and Fantasia 2000, this one was also not so well received. And it didn't help that mere weeks into the group's existence, Hart would pick up the multiple concussions which ultimately led to him being forced to retire from the ring altogether. Could things have worked out differently if the Canadian had more time in this new NWO to help establish it? Probably not. But at the very least, he might not have gone down as such a forgotten member, as he'd at least have been on TV wearing the group's colors for a little while longer. But what about the faction many people consider to be the WWF equivalent to the NWO during the late 90s, D-Generation X? Didn't they have a forgotten member too? Why, yes they did, and her name was Tori. That's right, we all know the major players from DX and the different incarnations: Shawn Michaels, Triple H, X-Pac, the New Age Outlaws, and Chyna. Hell, most people, if pushed, will even be able to recall that during the initial months of his existence, Rick Rude served as an enforcer of sorts for the faction. What's gone forgotten by many today, however, is that there was actually another female degenerate at one time. And no, we're not talking about Stephanie McMahon here. Rather, we're talking about Tori, a somewhat notable member of the WWF's women's roster between 1998 and 2001. Why was Tori involved in DX? Well, prior to this, she'd been the unlikely on-screen girlfriend to Kane. But when X-Pac began feuding with the Big Red Machine in 1999, he decided the best way to get one over on his former friend was to steal his girlfriend away. And with Sean Waltman being a degenerate in full at the turn of the millennium, this meant Tori would be inducted into the stable too as an honorary member once she began shacking up with the heel. Still though, it wasn't like she did much once she joined, and this has meant that as the years have gone on, less and less people have remembered that Tori was ever there at all. No, like with Sawyer Fulton and his time with Sanity, if you were to ask 100 wrestling fans to name all the members of DX, we're pretty sure it would be a small percentage who recalled the Portland native had once been involved. Obviously then, this is why whenever there are DX retrospectives today, you rarely see Tori get mentioned. And whenever there's a reunion segment on Raw, she never gets the call to appear. But it could be worse. At least this wasn't a forgotten run with a stable so hated at the time it completely nuked her run in WWF. No, something that bad could only be applied to our next subject, Ahmed Johnson, and his time with the Nation of Domination. Now, when you think of Ahmed Johnson today, you might think of a few different things, with one of them being a guy who was almost a huge star in WWE, and probably would have been were it not for his constant injuring of both himself and his opponents. And if you don't think of that, you likely think about the guy who feuded with the Nation of Domination throughout the tail end of the New Generation era, all while he was cutting completely incomprehensible promos so bizarre that even Scott Steiner and Sid would have been taken aback. What you likely don't think about, however, is the time Ahmed actually joined the Nation in the summer of 1997. And the reason you don't think about this is because it was a move so bad it killed any sense of momentum the Pearl River powerhouse had. Yes, why would someone spend so many months involved in a bitter blood feud with a group only for him to then tuck his tail between his legs and join forces with them? It would have been like if prior to WrestleMania 40, Cody Rhodes decided he couldn't beat Roman Reigns, and so the best thing for him to do was join the Bloodline instead. And on top of this, by the time August rolled around, he'd be booted out of the group, with this meaning that not only was his subsequent babyface turn and vow to bring down the nation once more bought by no one, but his run with them was so short, few fans remember it today. That's right, this was pretty much the worst of both worlds, as those who did remember Johnson's run with Farouk's faction lost faith in him because of it, and everyone else just forgot it happened at all. So you could make an argument that this represents the worst forgotten faction run of all, due to how much damage it did. But then each of the examples we've looked at today are all among the worst faction runs, as barely anyone remembers any of them today. We guess it just goes to show then that sometimes being included in a group isn't enough. No, you have to make yourself be seen if you want to truly stand out.